Oh, well, hello out there. I do believe we're live. So, welcome to the Saturday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're going to talk about a topic that was requested by one of you, the audience. And this topic is rock and pop music that went classical. And by this, we mean rock and pop music that was influenced by classical music directly, and more importantly, that referenced classical music. Let's get the idea of influence out of the way early because everything is kind of influenced by everything else. But certain types of music, certain bands, certain performers, certain composers, songwriters, they sometimes wear this influence on their sleeve. They do it intentionally, and that's the kind of music I want to talk about today. So let's start at the very pinnacle. Let's start with a group of artists who intentionally shoved classical music down the ears of their audiences who absolutely ate it up and loved it. And this was Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. Now, ELP sort of had a pedigree that put them in a good position to do this because when he was with his first major band, The Nice, Keith Emerson was classical crazy. He incorporated so much music directly into the performances that he would play live and on record. He referenced Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, the Pathetique. He referenced Blue Rondo or La Turque, which, albeit jazz, he played it in a sort of neoclassical style in his song America, based on Leonard Bernstein's modern composition from West Side Story. He incorporated part of the Ninth Symphony of Antonin Dvorak, loads of Bach in the Nice, absolutely loads of it. And Keith was this interesting keyboard player who was equally comfortable in the musical idioms of jazz and classical. And yet he was playing in a rock band, which is pretty much what the Nice were, to a rock audience. In fact, the Nice actually began as an R&B band that was backing the soul singer P.P. Arnold. So they were really a diverse group of musicians. And when Keith met up with Greg Lake from King Crimson and Carl Palmer, who had been in both the crazy world of Arthur Brown and Atomic Rooster, they went classical crazy. Let's just look at what was on their first album in terms of direct classical references. There was the Allegro Barbaro by Bartok. There were references to Janacek from his Sinfonietta. There was all sorts of stuff all over the place. And throughout ELP's career, both from the classical and romantic period, as well as modern European composers like Ginastera, who was an Argentinian composer but composed in the European style. He was all over the place. Again, loads of Bartok, Aaron Copland, the American modernist. But the album where they really went full in and did an entire three-piece rock band version of a monumentally popular classical piece. This was the Pictures at an Exhibition album from 71, where they performed the entirety of Modest Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition as a trio. And while that might have seemed ambitious and all the rest of it, it worked really well. And even though the album, they didn't even give them the decency to do it in the studio, it was recorded live and it sold really, really well. And there was a bit of a bonus track on there too, Nutrocker, which is, of course, a reference to Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker. So when I talk about bands that consciously do this, with ELP, there's no ambiguity because during an interview, Greg Lake was asked, what should people think of ELP's legacy? What would you want ELP's legacy to be? And he said that's simple. If we introduced classical music to new audiences that wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to hear it or the desire to hear it, then I would consider ELP a monumental success. Now, that's a huge statement because often bands will measure their success in terms of what they consider their own water break, what they would consider their own artistic achievements or record sales or the number of tickets sold. But no, Greg Lake said that for them, the way that he would measure their achievement is by introducing classical music to the masses, because ELP was really, really big in the 70s. They were all over the radio, they sold millions of records, and not a single album they put out didn't make very, very explicit references to classical music. And I'm not just talking about a quote, a quotation from in the musical world is when you throw in a line or a lick that references a pre-existing piece of music, classical or otherwise. ELP went far beyond that. They fully integrated either full length or large sections of compositions from well-known composers into their music. So I think ELP are a good starting point, but because I don't really want to do this one sequentially, let's go back and talk about some other origins of this pop and rock, or in any style of pop music that was directly or semi directly influenced by classical. And we've got a new viewer to this channel, David Brown. Welcome, David. We're just talking all about classical music that was directly and consciously influencing of pop and rock musicians. So let's go back about 20 years or so before ELP to the age of what we in retrospect called classic pop. Now, classic pop is usually rather orchestrated, or in some cases backed by a big band in terms of the music, and the featured star is almost always a vocalist. Think Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Dean Martin, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Bing Crosby, somewhat later on Andy Williams, Perry Como. You get the idea. And this, as I said on another video, was the golden age of the arranger, because it was the arranger that really made the songs come to life. Typically, these artists wouldn't feature new music, but would feature music that had already been around, pulled from what, again, in retrospect, we call the Great American Songbook. A lot of these songs came from Broadway, they came from stage and screen, they came from Tin Pan Alley, they came from some of the earliest songwriters of the pop music era, which, again, pop music is a 20th century invention with some roots in the late 19th century. So think people like Irving Berlin, one of the first super successful songwriters of this era, who wrote much of the American Songbook. Rodgers and Hammerstein, Rodgers and Hart were big as well. And so what differentiated Bing Crosby from Nat King Cole, from Frank Sinatra singing the same song in this era? The answer is the arranger, the person who would take the song, the melody and chord structure, and say, why, I want to do it like this. I want a string section to do this. I want a brass section to do this. Let's put a vibraphone in here. Let's put an electric guitar here. Let's put an acoustic guitar here, and write it all out, give it to the session players, and there you have it. That is what an arranger did. And there were so many great arrangers in this era. My personal favorite was Don Costa. And Jimmy Webb, one of the greatest contemporary songwriters of all, who sort of had a foot in the classic pop world and the rock and roll world, and later on in the country world too. Jimmy Webb was sort of a transitional songwriter who brought the era of classic pop into the era where the rock music idiom tended to dominate the pop charts in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even the 90s. And what Jimmy Webb said is that people like Don Costa and another wonderful arranger of that era, Gordon Jenkins, they were essentially fully refined, sophisticated, modernist classical composers. Now, why did they go into arrangements rather than writing symphonies or concerti? And there's several interesting answers. One is the financial incentive, in that Frank Sinatra was selling a lot more albums in the 50s and 60s than were modern classical composers. Indeed, the classical music, which actually didn't sell that badly in the 50s and 60s compared to later decades, it was usually the 19th century romanticists, your Beethovens, your Brahms, your Wagners, your Strausses, that really sold big. The modernist composers have always been a more difficult pill for audiences to swallow. I've done a live video all about that, so do check out the live section in this YouTube channel if you want to know more about my take on why that might be. And so a lot of people who in a previous generation, before pop music was invented, would have gone into composing for orchestras. or for chamber music groups. They went into either composing and or arranging music for the major pop stars of the day. And Webb made the point that if someone like Gordon Jenkins or Don Costa or Nelson Riddle wanted to be the Beethovens of the mid 20th century, they certainly had the talent where they could do that. And when you listen to some of these men's arrangements, you can really hear that while they are influenced by the jazzy overtones of the pop of the day, they clearly had a background not just in orchestration, but in neoclassical, let's call it neo-romantic, maybe more accurate, composition. And so you could say that a lot of the pop music, while its more direct idiom in terms of musical language was offshoots of jazz, there was also a strongly classical element. Now, another media through which otherwise modernist classical composers would have got their music out that existed in the 20th century that did not exist before was the movie, the screen. We talked about the stage earlier. Well, there was also the screen. And so you had composers who were both serious classical composers that also wrote for film. Think one of my very favorite modern orchestral composers, Aram Khachaturian, the Armenian who composed in the Soviet Union of the time. And you also have people like Miklos Rosa, who wrote he wrote symphonic compositions, but he's most well known for his epic film scores of the mid 20th century. Think Ben Hur. Another great composer you could put into this category was Maurice Jarre, the French composer who did Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago and so many interesting films. By the 80s, he interestingly went into synthesized and electronic music. So he was always someone who was quite ahead of the curve. By the way, I do have a top of my head here, but I'm not an expert in lighting, people, but anyway, just sit back, relax, and listen if you're interested in this. So that's another thing that we have to talk to when we talk about the classical influence. So let's now look at some of the rock bands that incorporated classical music prior to ELP becoming the kings of classical progressive rock. And I want to look at one of my very favorite bands ever, the Moody Blues. They got a fresh new lineup in the mid 60s, which included Justin Hayward on vocals and guitar and John Lodge on bass guitar and vocals, both of them excellent songwriters. Now, the record label DRAM, which was a subsidiary of Decca, went up to them and said, "We want you to do a rock and roll version of Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, the New World Symphony." And they thought about it and they said, "Yeah, that's kind of cool, but we've got a better idea. We're going to write our own music and incorporate it into a modern orchestral composition." And so, with the conductor David Knight, they did just that. And it became the album Days of Future Past from 1967, which had lush orchestrations and wonderful hit songs whose edited versions became huge singles, Nights in White Satin, Tuesday Afternoon. Now, the Moody Blues always retained this kind of symphonic style, but they only played in their golden period with an orchestra on that first album. After that, all of the string parts and brass parts were covered exclusively on the Mellotron of Mike Pinder, which was all over the Days of Future Past album as well. But you were somewhat more mobile if you were lugging around a huge and heavy musical instrument, a keyboard-based musical instrument to simulate these sounds, than you would be traveling with an orchestra, which, as ELP found out on their 1977 tour, can be very, very costly if you're going to tour the world with one. Now, I've also in a previous video talked about what the Mellotron is. The short version is it's a giant organ-like, in terms of its appearance, keyboard instrument, and inside of it are tapes. And those tapes have recordings of, let's say, of many different instruments: solo violin, string section, brass section, timpani, also any instrument that you can generally think of. And when you press down the middle C, the tape engages, the tape head meets the tape, where a violin, if you're on violin mode, has middle C. D, the same thing. And so it was a very weighty instrument, but luckily Mike Pinder, the Moody Blues keyboardist, he had worked in the Mellotron factory, and so he was uniquely placed to fix it on the spot. And because of that, he was never particularly sympathetic to people who talked about its notorious unreliability. We might as well mention another famous mellotronist, but who's probably equally, if not more famous, for his piano and synthesizer work, and this was Rick Wakeman. Now, Rick Wakeman literally was a classical musician. He studied at a music college, the Royal College of Music in London, and he got bit by the session bug when he was at his music college. And so he started to attend fewer and fewer classes and play on more and more sessions, which naturally were pop sessions. But he never lost his love for classical music, and his own solo albums are very much in sort of a neo romantic and even neo medieval style. His debut album, The Six Wives of King Henry VIII, Journey to the Center of the Earth, which had full orchestra, the myths and legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, all of it, while played by ultra modern keyboard instruments, synthesizers, mellotrons, electric organs, what have you, it definitely nodded to the fact that he was classically trained, musically literate, and classically capable. And he even incorporated quite a lot of that in the band Yes, another one of the titans of progressive rock from that era. Again, like I said, we're going to be jumping around eras a bit. Another great arranger who was somewhat younger than Costa and Jenkins was a guy called Don Sebesky. And he did so many string quartet and sometimes full orchestra arrangements for a lot of great jazz musicians. And so while this cannot really be called classical or even neoclassical, what it showed is that the jazz world retained a desire to incorporate instruments typically associated with classical music into the arrangements of their albums. Sebesky did two of my very favorite albums by the wonderful trumpet player Freddie Hubbard, First Light and Skydive. He did a lot of stuff with Wes Montgomery, including Bumpin', my favorite Wes Montgomery album. He worked with the great Paul Desmond, Maynard Ferguson, the great George Benson, Chet Baker, Joe Beck, no relation to Jeff Beck, but one hell of a guitarist as well. Maybe they have a distant relative that we don't know about. One album that he did that I find really interesting in terms of the arrangements is from 1972, and this is called Time and Love by the vocal duo Jackie and Roy. Now, Jackie and Roy were themselves very interesting. They were a husband and wife duo of jazz vocalists, but they always incorporated a lot of avant garde yet highly melodic elements into their music. And they went the most out there with Time and Love, but it was very listenable. It was just an album that sort of fused a lot of different genres. There are definitely some classical influences there, including the title track that was composed by Sebesky. There was a song called A Simple Song that was composed by the modernist composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein. And there was actually a vocal version of a track by Villalobos, one of the great Spanish influenced composers of the modern era. He was born in Brazil, but in that sort of Latin feel. If you're talking about Spanish music, Portuguese, Brazilian music, it's all in that very Latin idiom that has become really popular. And so this album is really a feast for the ears. I highly recommend it. It's on your Spotify's, it's on your other streaming services. Definitely check that out. And Jackie and Roy had been around for a while by then. They got started in Chicago in the 40s, but that album was really an interesting example of how arrangers that had one foot in the jazz world, one foot in the classical world, and almost one foot in the psychedelic world could create something really interesting, a pure fusion album, if there ever was one. There are also sort of more simple and straightforward versions of fusion between classical and pop music. There was a girl group when those were very popular in the early and mid 60s called The Toys. They were something of a one-hit wonder, but that one hit was called A Lover's Concerto. And the entire melody line of that was based on Bach's Minuet in G major. And it became a huge hit. It sold lots and lots and lots of records. We can look at Procol Harum, who were sort of a progressive rock band, but they were really kind of their own genre. And of course, their biggest single, I've done videos of them. They have so many great albums. You should definitely listen to all of them. But their biggest, most well-known single was A Whiter Shade of Pale, which makes a very strong reference to Bach's Air on a G string. And that happens to be one of my favorite songs, but possibly one of yours too. Um, Eric Carmen, once he left the Raspberries, he did one of his many hit songs, All by Myself, in 1975, which referenced the neo romantic second piano concerto of Sergei Rachmaninoff. Now, Sergei lived well into the 20th century, and because of that, he luckily recorded most of his own pieces. And so here we see something where one of the lost great romantics, because he was really a neo-romantic. He lived long after the golden age of romantic European classical music, but we see his concerto being incorporated into the chordal structure and melody line, and even influencing Eric Carmen's piano solo in this hit song. He performed it live on one of my favorite TV shows, The Midnight Special, so definitely check out his performance there. Billy Joel was someone who was very much influenced by classical music. Like Rick Wakeman, he is fully classically literate and has even composed full-scale modern classical compositions. So he incorporated a lot of references and nods to classical music in his songs. His song from '83, The Night, incorporates part of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. Really, really good stuff. You'll for sure want to check that out. Let's see what else we've got. Well, we've got the disco era, and while a bit simplistic, you have got Walter Murphy's A Fifth of Beethoven. It appeared on the top-selling Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, and while it just referenced over and over again the famous opening chords to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it was catchy, it got people dancing, and it was played on the radio. You can't get to much more of a direct reference to classical music than that. Deep Purple had a lot of classical references in their music because John Lord, the keyboard player and major songwriter, was a modern classical composer. One of the first things Deep Purple did, in fact, the first thing with its famous Mark II lineup, was the Concerto for Group and Orchestra, a real test of just how much you could really fuse classical style music and rock music. On an artistic level, I think it worked really well, but the band, after another composition of Lord's for orchestra and band called Gemini Suite, went back to their hard rock roots, if you will. But there were always nods to classical music from both John Lord, who was sort of a modern romanticist and somewhat of a modernist, and Ritchie Blackmore, who was always really fascinated by medieval and Renaissance music. In fact, when he left Deep Purple for the final time, he started a largely acoustic band called Blackmore's Night that was essentially a modern style rock band that played arrangements of Renaissance style European music. So there's that influence as well. Let's see what else we can think of on our listorama. We've got Phil Spector, who incorporated some elements, some quotes of classical music in what he called 3-minute symphonies, his songs that incorporated a production style that eschewed definition and high fidelity for a sort of nebulous wall of sound, as he called it. And he achieved this by doubling and tripling instruments, so having pianos and guitars and trumpets and strings all play in unison, and he'd even have loads of percussion playing all at once, which gave the vocalist who he was featuring a literal nebulous but thick and loud wall of sound. It sounded really good on AM radio because that was where it was intended to be heard. So that's another example you can point to. You can point to Leonard Bernstein, who, as I said, a classical conductor and modernist composer, but he was very fascinated by modern pop music and even went on one of his television shows to praise the Beatles and to praise Janis Ian, who he liked very much, a songwriter of that era, who later did I Learned the Truth at 17, that love was meant for beauty queens. Homer Simpson did his own version of that. But Leonard Bernstein was generally one of the few voices from the proper classical community that said that, hey, these pop and rock guys are actually more harmonically sophisticated than you might think. And in turn, the pop and rock world loved Leonard Bernstein because he wasn't just a composer, he actually wrote what we could consider songs. Look at the songs from the musical West Side Story that entered the pop nomenclature. We already referenced him once before with The Nice, Keith Emerson doing a version of America. Only the original was in an odd meter. Keith played it in 4/4 and really rocked out, incorporating a bit of Dvorak in between. So I absolutely think that on this list, Leonard Bernstein has a place. And there are many more examples, far too many to name. But even in the 90s, when we think of classical music being less influenced, having less of an influence on rock, well, we have hip hop. And at the end of the 90s, in 1997 to be precise, an experimental hip hop album called The Rhapsody Overture came out that combined the talents of modern rappers and hip hop producers with traditional classical music. And surprisingly, there was a hit on the album, and it was from one of my absolute favorite producers in all of hip hop. And this was Warren G, who used a sample of Borodin's Prince Igor from the opera Prince Igor, and this was one of the Polovistian dances that he called as a song Prince Igor, and he was rapping while at the same time a operatic singer was singing, and it really became a big hit. The whole album attempted to fuse hip hop and classical, and some of it worked pretty well, some of it less so. But when we really think of classical and hip hop fusing in a way that really got people's attention, turned heads, and sold records, that was Prince Igor with Warren G. I'm sure there are many more examples that we could run through, but I think that's a pretty decent list. We could always look at sort of things that are sometimes lumped in with classical music, the classical music of particular cultures. Spain, as I said, had, even though a very much a part of Europe, had a classical tradition that was always very unique because it was rooted in the playing of the guitar. It was rooted in the Andalusian traditions that incorporated some Arabic music. And so we have flamenco and classical Spanish guitar. That influences all over rock and pop music. Think Classical Gas by, who is it? Mason Williams, I think, did Classical Gas. Let me look that up. I think it was Mason Williams. Talk among yourselves. Yeah, that was Mason Williams who did Classical Gas. So many of the prog rock guitarists, but particularly Steve Howe of Yes, incorporated so much classical guitar playing. Steve Hackett of Genesis has done a lot of neoclassical guitar playing. He was very influenced by Segovia. Eddie Van Halen, very influenced by classical music. He was classically literate. His father was a jazz musician, but with a classical background. Eruption, the most famous of all of Eddie's guitar solos. So much neoclassicism in there. We've got a comment from David in the chat. A lot of disco seemed okay. Yes, there was a lot of string arrangements in disco music, and in fact in the soul and R&B of the day. And while you couldn't necessarily call it classical composition, it definitely nodded to the fact that both 70s style soul and disco, which was sort of a stepchild of soul and R&B, definitely made reference to that kind of music because of a lot of thick string arrangements. Speaking of which, we can look at ELO, the Electric Light Orchestra, who incorporated not only a small chamber string section into the band, but they referenced a lot of classical music. And they even did it tongue-in-cheek. Roll Over Beethoven was a Chuck Berry song, which sort of mocked the fact that, hey, rock and roll is here to stay, classical is for old people. But ELO did a version that turned it on its head by, referencing a lot of Beethoven, playing it in a neoclassical sort of prog rocky style. And the album Discovery, which was sort of ELO both embracing and mocking disco, those strings that you mentioned, David, in the chat, absolutely very much there. So yeah, like I said, so there are so many things that can be mentioned. And then there's, of course, something that sometimes works out and sometimes doesn't. And this is the ye old rock band with an orchestra. When you do it in the studio, it tends to work very well because you have a controlled environment where you're miking things correctly. The arranger is usually there to work out any eccentricities. Doing it live is more difficult. The Nice did it. Like I said, Deep Purple did it. ELP did it, going on the road with an orchestra. In their later years, once they sort of went on the nostalgia circuit, the Moody Blues started doing it. Metallica did it with the San Francisco Orchestra. And that was relatively successful for a hard band. Guns N' Roses, their song November Rain, has orchestral parts. So, again, even in genres where we wouldn't think orchestral arrangements would necessarily fit, they do. And again, while not technically modernist, let alone neoclassical composition, it definitely hints at that musical idiom, which in some ways I think will still remain alive. I wonder what other references we can think of, because I'm sure that there are more. Um, with prog rock, there's really no shortage. I mean, yes, toured with an orchestra in the early 2000s. Lots of bands have actually toured with orchestras. Sometimes it doesn't work out very well because obviously miking can be an issue. Whether you don't want the guitar amplifier mic to bleed into the violin mic, you have to get the levels right, which has become easier and easier as mixing consoles have got more and more sophisticated, and as sound engineers understand more and more about complex miking situations. Well, I think that's those are all the examples that I can think of on the spot here, but I'm sure that those watching the replay will think of many more. As always, you can share this. Remember to like and subscribe. You can now buy a membership, send a super chat if you wish on this channel. We're only 400 subscribers away to becoming a fully professional partner of YouTube. I think they have to take me to the Silicon Valley to initiate me into some ceremony, but we'll see what happens if I get to that number. David Oss in the chat, am I a musician? Yeah, I was classically trained and I played the drums. I'm not active anymore in music apart from this channel, so you could say I'm really active in music, but I'm not on the stage and haven't been for a while. But yeah, I was a drummer. So I've been on both sides of, I've been the listener and I've been the performer, and you know what, they're both really fun and I think they're both really rewarding. No problem, David, good question. I've never actually mentioned that on this channel, I don't think so. I'm glad I mentioned that. So, as always, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. For those of you new to the channel, I do these streams in around this time on Saturdays and Sundays, and then release short videos throughout the week. Okay, everyone, talk soon. Take care.